The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, narrated by BedRiddenBear. Chapter 7. Get up! What you bout? I opened my eyes and looked around, trying to make out where I was. It was after sunup, and I had been sound asleep. Pap was standing over me, looking sour and sick too. He says, "What you doing with this gun?" I judged he didn't know nothing about what he had been doing, so I says, "Somebody tried to get in, so I was layin' for 'em." "Why didn't you roust me out?" "Well, I tried to, but I couldn't. I couldn't budge you." "Well, all right. Don't stand there palavering all day, but out with you and see if there's a fish on the line for breakfast. I'll be along in a minute." He unlocked the door and I cleared out up the riverbank. I noticed some pieces of limbs and such things floating down, and a sprinkle of bark, so I knowed the river had begun to rise. I reckoned I would have great times now if it was over at the town. The June rise used to be always luck for me, because as soon as that rise begins, here comes the cordwood floating down and pieces of log rafts, sometimes a dozen log rafts together, so all you have to do is to catch them and sell them to the wood yards and the sawmill. I went along up the bank with one eye out for Pap, and t'other one out for what the rise might fetch along. Well, all at once here comes a canoe, just a beauty too, about 13 or 14 foot long, riding high like a duck. I shot head first off the bank like a frog, clothes and all on, and struck out for the canoe. I just expected there'd be somebody laying down in it, because people often done that to fool folks, and when the chap had pulled off a skiff outmost to it, they'd raise up and laugh at him. But it warn't no this time. It was a drift canoe sure enough. I climbed in and paddled her ashore. Thanks I, the old man would be glad when he sees this. She's worth $10. But when I got to shore, Pap wasn't in sight yet, and as I was running her into a little crick like a gully, all hung over with vines and willows, I struck another idea. I judged I'd hide her good, and then instead of taking to the woods when I'd run off, I'll go down the river about 50 mile and camp in one place for good, and not have such a rough time trampling on foot. It was pretty close to the shanty, and I thought I'd heard the old man coming all the time, but I got her hid, and then I out and looked around a bunch of willows, and there was the old man down the path a piece, just drawing up a bead on a bird with his gun, so he hadn't seen anything. When he got along, I was hard at it, taking up a trot line. He abused me a little for being so slow, but I told him I fell in the river, and that was what made me so long. I knowed he'd see I was wet, and then he would be asking questions. We got 5 catfish off the lines and went home. While we laid off after breakfast to sleep up, both of us being about worn out, I got to thinking about if I could fix up some way to keep Pap and the widow from trying to follow me. It'd be a certainer thing than trusting to luck to get far enough off before they'd miss me. You see, all kinds of things might happen. Well, I didn't see no way for a while, but by and by Pap raised up a minute to drink another barrel of water, and he says, "Another time a man comes a prowling around here, you roust me up out, you hear? That man weren't no for good. I'd shot him. Next time you roust me out, you hear?" Then he dropped down and went to sleep again. But when he had been giving me the very idea I wanted, I says to myself, I can fix it now so nobody won't think of following me. About 12 o'clock we turned out and went along up the bank. The river was coming up pretty fast and lots of driftwood going by on the rise. By and by along some comes parts of a log raft, 9 logs fast together. We went out with the skiff and towed it ashore. Then we had dinner. Anybody but Pap was waiting to see the day through, so as to catch more stuff, but that weren't Pap's style. 9 logs was enough for one time. He must have shoved right off over to town and sell. So he locked me in and took the skiff and started off towing the raft about 3:30. I judged he wouldn't come back that night. I waited till I reckoned he had got a good start. Then I out with my saw and went to work on that log again. Before he was t'other side of the river, I was out of the hole. Him and his raft was just a speck on the water away off yonder. I took the sack of cornmeal and took it to where the canoe was hid, and shoved the vines and branches apart and put it in. Then I done the same with the side of bacon, then the whiskey jug. I took all the coffee and sugar there was, and all the ammunition. I took the wadding, I took the bucket and gourd, I took a dipper and a tin cup, and my old saw and 2 blankets, and the skillet and the coffee pot. I took fish lines and matches and other things everywhere that was worth a cent. I cleaned out the place. I wanted an axe, but there wasn't any, only the one out of the wood pile, and I knowed why I was going to leave that. I fetched out the gun, and now I was done. I'd worn the ground a good deal crawling out of the hole and dragging out so many things, so I fixed that as good as I could from the outside by scattering dust on the place, which covered up the smoothness and the sawdust. Then I fixed the piece of log back into its place and put 2 rocks under it and one against it to hold it there, for it was bent up at that place and didn't quite touch the ground. If you stood 4 or 5 foot away and didn't know it was sawed, you would never notice it, and besides, this was the back of the cabin, and it weren't likely anybody would go fooling around here. It was all the grass clear to the canoe, so I hadn't left a track. I followed around to see. I stood on the bank and looked out over the river. All safe. So I took the gun and went up a piece into the woods and was hunting around for some birds when I see a wild pig. Hogs soon went wild in them bottoms after they had gotten away from the prairie farms. I shot this fellow and took him into the camp. I took the axe and smashed it in the door. I beat it and hacked it considerably a-doing it. I fetched the pig in and took him back nearly to the table and hacked into its throat with the axe and laid him down on the ground to bleed. I say ground because it was ground, hard packed and no boards. Well, next I took an old sack and put a lot of big rocks in it, all I could drag, and I started it from the pig and dragged it to the door and through the woods, down the river, and dumped it in, and down it sunk, out of sight. You could easy see that something had been dragging over the ground. I did wish Tom Sawyer was there. I knowed he'd take an interest in this kind of business and throw in the fancy touches. Nobody could spread himself like Tom Sawyer in such a thing as that. Well, last I pulled out some of my hair and bloodied the axe good, and stuck it on the backside and slung the axe in the corner. Then I took up the pig and held him to my breast with my jacket, so he couldn't drip, till I got a good piece below the house, and then dumped him in the river. Now I thought of something else, so I went and got the bag of meal and my old saw out of the canoe and fetched him to the house. I took the bag to where it used to stand and ripped a hole in the bottom of it with the saw, for there weren't no knives and forks on the place. Pap done everything with his clasp knives about the cooking. Then I carried the sack about 100 yards across the grass and through the widows east of the house, to shallow lake that was 5 miles wide and full of rushes, and ducks too, you might say, in the season. There was a slough or a creek leading out of it on the other side that went miles away. I don't know where, but it didn't go to the river. The mill sifted out and made a little track all the way to the lake. I dropped Pap's wheatstone there too, so as it to look like it had been done by accident. Then I tied up the rip in the mill sack with a string, so it wouldn't leak no more, and took it and my saw to the canoe again. It was about dark now, so I dropped the canoe down the river under some willows that hung over the bank, and waited for the moon to rise. I made a fast to a willow, then I took a bite to eat, and by laid down in the canoe to smoke a pipe and lay out a plan. I says to myself they'd follow the track of that sackful of rocks to the shore, and then drag the river for me, and they'll follow that mule track to the lake and go browsing down the crick that leads out of it to find the robbers that killed me and took the things. They won't ever hunt the river for anything but my dead carcass. They'll soon get tired of that and won't bother no more about me. All right, I can stop anywhere I want to. Jackson's Island is good enough for me. I know that island pretty well, and nobody ever comes there. And then I can paddle over to the town nights and slink around and pick up things I want. Jackson's Island's the place. I was pretty tired, and the first thing I knew I was asleep. When I woke up, I didn't know where I was for a minute. I sat up and looked around a little scared. Then I remembered the river looked miles and miles across. The moon was so bright I could count the drift logs that went a-slippin' along, black and still, hundreds of yards out from shore. Everything was dead quiet, and it looked late and smelt late. You know what I mean? I don't know the words to put it in. I took a good gap and a stretch, and was just going to unhitch and start when I heard a sound away over the water. I listened. Pretty soon I made it out. It was that dull kind of regular sound that comes from the oars working in rowlocks when it's still night. I peeped out through the willow branches, and there it was, a skiff, away across the water. I couldn't tell how many was in it. It kept a-coming, and when it was abreast of me, I see there weren't but one man in it. Thinks I maybe it's Pap, though I weren't expectin' him. He dropped below me with the current, and by he came a-swinging up shore in the easy water, and he went by so close I could reach out the gun and touch him. Well, it was Pap, sure enough, and sober too, by the way he laid his oars. I didn't lose no time. The next minute I was spinning downstream, soft but quick, in the shade of the bank. I made 2 miles and a half, and then struck out 1/4 of a mile or more towards the middle of the river, because pretty soon I'd be passing the ferry landing, and people might see me and hail me. I got out amongst the driftwood, and then laid down in the bottom of the canoe and let her float. I laid there, and had a good rest and a smoke out of my pipe, looking away into the sky, not a cloud in it. The sky looks ever so deep when you lay down on your back in the moonshine. I never knowed it before, and how far a body can hear on the waters such nights. I heard people talking at the ferry landing. I heard what they say, too, every word of it. One man says it was getting towards the long days and the short nights now. T'other one said this weren't one of the short ones, he reckoned. And they laughed, and he said it over again, and they laughed again. Then they waked up another fellow and told him, and laughed, but he didn't laugh. He ripped out something brisk and said him let him alone. The first fellow said he'd load to tell him to his old woman. She wouldn't think it was pretty good, but he said that weren't nothing to some things he had said in his time. I heard one man said it was nearly 3 o'clock, and he hoped daylight wouldn't wait more than about a week longer. After that, the talk got further and further away, and I couldn't make out the words any more, but I could hear the mumble, and now and then a laugh or two. It seemed a long ways off. I was away below the ferry now. I rose up, and there was Jackson's Island, about 2 miles and a half downstream, heavy timbered and standing up in the middle of the river, big and dark and solid, like a steamboat without any lights. There weren't any signs of the bar in the head. It was all under water now. It didn't take me long to get there. I shot past the head at the ripping rate. The current was so swift, and then I got into the dead water and landed in the side towards the Illinois shore. I run the canoe into the deep dent in the bank that I knowed about. I had to part the willow branches to get in, and when I made a fast, nobody could see the canoe from the outside. I went up and sat down on a log at the head of the island, and looked out on the river bank and the black driftwood and away over to the town, 3 miles away, where there was about 3 or 4 lights twinkling. A monstrous big lumber raft was about a mile upstream, coming along down, with a lantern in the middle of it. I watched it come creeping down, and when it was most abreast of where I stood, I heard a man say, "Stern oars there! Heave her head to starboard!" I heard that just as plain as the man was by my side. There was a little gray in the sky now, so I stepped into the woods and laid down for a nap before breakfast. Chapter 8. The sun was up so high when I waked that I judged it was after 8 o'clock. I laid there in the grass and the cool shade, thinking about things and feeling rested and rather comfortable and satisfied. I could see the sun out of 1 or 2 holes, but mostly it was the big trees all about, and gloomy in there amongst them. There was a freckled places on the ground where the light sifted down through the trees, and the freckled places swapped up about a little, showing there was a little breeze up there. A couple of squirrels sat on a limb and jabbered at me very friendly. I was powerful, lazy, and comfortable. I didn't want to get up and cook breakfast. Well, I was dozing off again, and when I thinks to hear, I hear a deep sound of a boom away up the river. I rouses up and rests on my elbow and listens. Pretty soon I hears it again. I hopped up and went and looked out at a hole in the leaves, and I see a bunch of smoke laying on the water a long ways up, about abreast the ferry, and there was the ferry boat full of people floating along down. I knowed what was the matter now. Boom! I see the white smoke squirt out of the ferry boat's side. You see, they was firing cannon over the water, trying to make my carcass come up to the top. I was pretty hungry, but it weren't doing no good for me to start a fire, because they might see the smoke. So I sat there and watched the cannon smoke and listened to the boom. The river was a mile wide there, and it always looks pretty on a summer morning. So I was having a good enough time seeing them hunt for my remainders if I only had a bite to eat. Well then, I happened to think about how they always put quicksilver in loaves of bread and float them off, because they always go right to the drowned carcass and stop there. So says I'll keep a lookout, and if any of them's floating around after me, I'll give them a show. I changed to the Illinois edge of the island to see what luck I could have, and I weren't disappointed. A big double loaf come along. I most got it with a long stick, but my foot slipped and she floated out farther. Of course, I was where the current set and the closest to the shore. I knowed enough for that, but by and by along comes another one, and this time I won. I took out the plug and shook out the little dab of quicksilver and set my teeth in it. It was baker's bread. What the quality eat? None of your low-down corn pone. I got a good place amongst the leaves and sat there on a log, munching the bread and watching the ferry boat, and very well satisfied. And then something struck me. I says, now I reckon the widow or the parsons or somebody prayed that this bread would find me, and here it has gone and done it. So there ain't no doubt, but there is something in that thing, that is. There's something in it when a body like the widow or the parsons pray, but it don't work for me, and I reckon it don't work for only just the right kind. I lit a pipe and had a good long smoke, and went on watching. The ferry boat was floating with the current, and I allowed I'd have a chance to see who was aboard when she came along, because she would come in so close where the bread did. When she got pretty well along down towards me, put out my pipe and went to where I fished out the bread and laid down behind a log on the bank in a little open place. Where the log forked, I could peep through. By and by she came along, and she drifted in so close that they could run out a plank and walk ashore. Most everybody was on the boat. Pap and Judge Thatcher and Bessie Thatcher and Joe Harper and Tom Sawyer and his old Aunt Polly and Sid and Mary and plenty more. Everybody was talking about the murder, but the captain broke in and says, "Look sharp now. The current sets in the closest here, and maybe he's washed ashore and got tangled amongst the brush at the water's edge. I hope so, anyway." I didn't hope so. They all crowded up and leaned over the rails nearly in my face and kept still, watching with all their might. I could see them first rate, but they couldn't see me. Then the captain sung out, "Stand away!" and the cannon let off such a blast right before me that it made me deaf with the noise and pretty near blinded me with the smoke, and I judged I was gone. If they'd had some bullets in, I'd reckon they'd got a corpse they was after. Well, I see it I weren't hurt, thank to goodness. The boat floated on and went out of sight around the shoulder of the island. I could hear the booming now and then, further and further off, and by, after an hour, I didn't hear it no more. The island was 3 miles long. I judged they had got to the foot and was giving it up, but they didn't yet a while. They turned around the foot of the island and started up the channel on the Missouri side, under steam and booming in once in a while as they went. I crossed over to that side and watched them. Then they got abreast of the head of the island, they quit shooting and dropped over to the Missouri shore and went home to the town. I knowed I was all right now. Nobody else would come a hunting after me. I got my traps out of the canoe and made me a nice camp in the thick woods. I made a kind of tent out of my blankets to put my things under so the rain couldn't get them. I catched a catfish and haggled him open with my saw, and toward sundown I started my campfire and had supper. Then I set out a line to catch some fish for breakfast. When it was dark, I set my campfire smoking and feeling pretty well satisfied, but by and by it got sort of lonesome, and so I went to set out on the bank and listen to the current swashing along and counting the stars and drift logs and rafts that come down, and then went to bed. There ain't no better way to put it in time when you are lonesome. You can't stay so. You soon get over it. And so for 3 days and nights, no difference, just the same thing. But the next day I went exploring around down through the island. I was boss of it. It all belonged to me, so to say, and I wanted to know all about it, but mainly I wanted to put in the time. I found plenty strawberries, ripe and prime, and green and summer grapes, and green raspberries, and the green blackberries was just beginning to show. They would all come by handy, and by I judged. Well, I went foolin' along in the deep woods till I judged I weren't far from the foot of the island. I had my gun along, but I hadn't shot nothing. It was for protection. Thought I would kill some game nigh home. About this time I mighty near stepped on a good-sized snake, and it went sliding off through the grass and flowers, and I after it, trying to get a shot at it. I clipped along, and all of a sudden I bounded right on the ashes of a campfire that was still smoking. My heart jumped up amongst my lungs. I never waited to look further, but my uncocked gun and I went sneaking back on my tiptoes as fast as I ever could. Every now and then I stopped a second amongst the thick leaves and listened, but my breath come so hard I couldn't hear nothing else. I slunk along another piece further, then listened again, and so on, and so on. If I see a stump, I took it for a man. If I trod on a stick and broke it, it made me feel like a person had cut one of my breaths in two, and I only got half, and the short half too. When I got to camp, I weren't feeling very brash. There weren't much sand in my craw, but I says, this ain't no time to be foolin' around. So I got all my traps in my canoe again, so as to have them out of sight, and I put out the fire and scattered the ashes around to look like it's an old last year's camp, and then clumb a tree. I reckon I was up in the tree 2 or 3 hours, but I didn't see nothing. I didn't hear nothing. I only thought I heard and seen as much as 1,000 things. Well, I couldn't stay up there forever, so at last I got down, but I kept in the thick woods and on the lookout all the time. All I could get to eat was berries and what was left over from breakfast. By the time it was night, I was pretty hungry, so when it was good and dark, I slid out from shore before the moonrise and paddled over to the Illinois bank. About 1/4 of a mile I went out in the woods and cooked a supper, and I had about made up my mind I wouldn't stay there all night when I heard a plunkety-plunk, plunkety-plunk, and says to myself, horses coming. And next I hear people's voices. I got everything into the canoe as quick as I could, and then went creeping through the woods to see what I could find out. I hadn't got far when I heard a man say, "We better camp here if we can find a good place. The horses is about beat out. Let's look around." I didn't wait, but shoved out and paddled away easy. I tied up in the old place and reckoned I would sleep in the canoe. I didn't sleep much. I couldn't, somehow, for thinking. And every time I waked up, I thought somebody had me by the neck. So the sleep didn't do me no good. By and by, I says to myself, I can't live this way. I'm a-going to find out who is there that's here on the other island with me. I'll find it out or bust. Well, I felt better right off. So I took my paddle and slid out from shore just a step or two, and then let the canoe drop along down amongst the shadows. The moon was shining, and outside of the shadows it made it most as light as day. I poked along well on to an hour, everything still as rocks and sound asleep. Well, by this time I was most down to the foot of the island. A little ripply, cool breeze began to blow, and that was as good as saying the night was about done. I give her a turn with the paddle and brung her nose to shore. Then I got my gun and slipped out and into the edge of the woods. I sat down there on a log and I looked out through the leaves. I see the moon go off watch and the darkness begin to blanket the river. But in a little while I see a pale streak over the treetops, and I knowed the day was coming. So I took my gun and I slipped off towards where I had ran across the campfire, stopping every minute or two to listen. But I hadn't no luck somehow. I couldn't seem to find the place. But by and by, sure enough, I catched a glimpse of fire away through the trees. I went for it, cautious and slow. By and by, I was close enough to have a look, and there laid a man on the ground. It most gave me the fantods. He had a blanket around his head, and his head was nearly in the fire. I sat there behind a clump of bushes in about 6 foot of him, and kept my eyes on him steady. It was getting gray daylight now. Pretty soon he gapped and stretched himself and hove off the blanket, and it was Miss Watson's Jim. I bet I was glad to see him, I says. "Hello, Jim," and skipped out. He bounced up and stared at me wild. Then he drops down on his knees and put his head and his hands together and says, "Don't hurt me, don't. I hain't ever done no harm to a goose. I always liked dead people and done all I could for 'em. You go get 'em in de river again, where you belongs. Dem doin' nothing to old Jim, and all it was your friend." Well, I weren't long making him understand I weren't dead, and I was never so glad to see him. I weren't lonesome now. I told him I weren't afraid of him telling the people where I was. I talked along, but he only sat there and looked at me, never said nothing. Then says, "It's good daylight. Let's get breakfast. Make up your campfire good." "What's the use of making up de campfire to cook strawberries in sich truck? But you got a gun, hain't you? Den we can get something better than strawberries." "Strawberries in such truck," I says. "Is that where you live on?" "I couldn't get nothing else," he says. "Why, how long have you been on the island, Jim?" "I come here tonight after you's killed. What all that time?" "Yes, indeedy." "And ain't you had nothing but some kind of rubbish to eat?" "No, sir, nothing else." "Well, you must be most starved, ain't you?" "I reckon I could eat a hoss. I think I could." "How long you been in de island?" "Since the night I got killed." "No way. What has you lived on? But you got a gun. Oh, yes, you got a gun. That's good. Now you killin' something and I make him to fire." So we went over to where the canoe was, and while he built a fire in a grassy open place amongst the trees, I fetched meal and bacon and coffee pot and frying pan and sugar and tin cups, and the nigger was set back considerable, because he reckoned it was all done with witchcraft. I catched a good big catfish too, and Jim cleaned him with his knife and fried him. When the breakfast was ready, we lolled on the grass and eat it smoking hot. Jim laid in it with all his might, for he was most about starved. Then when we had got pretty well stuffed, we laid off and lazied. By and by, Jim says, "But looky here, Huck, you's killed in dat shanty, if'n, weren't you?" Then I told him the whole thing, and he said it was smart. He said Tom Sawyer couldn't get up no better plan than what I had. Then I says, "How do you come to be here, Jim, and how'd you get here?" He looked pretty uneasy and didn't say nothing for a minute. Then he says, "Maybe I better not tell you." "Why, Jim?" "Well, dey's reasons. But you wouldn't tell on me if I's to tell you, would you, Huck?" "Blame if I would, Jim." "Well, I believe you, Huck. I run off." "Jim!" "But mind, you said you wouldn't tell. You know you said you wouldn't tell, Huck." "Well, I did. I said I wouldn't, and I'll stick to it. Honest Injun, I will. People call me a low-down abolitionist and despise me for keeping mum, but that don't make no difference. I ain't a-going to tell. I ain't going to go back there anyways. So now, let's know all about it." "Well, You see, it is this way. Old that's Miss Watson, she pecks on me all the time and treats me pooty rough. And she always says she wouldn't sell me down to Orleans, but I noticed there was a nigger trading around the place considerably lately, and I begging to get uneasy. Well, one night I creeps to do the pooty late, and the do weren't quite shitting. I hear old missus tell the widow she went and tell me to down to New Orleans, but she didn't want to, but she could get it $800 for me, and it us such a big stack of money she couldn't resist. The widow, she tried to get her to say she wouldn't do it, but I never waited to hear the res. I lit out mighty quick, I tell you. I tuck in the shin down the hill and expect to steal a skiff long the schoomers above the town. But they was people a-stirring yet, so I hid in the old tumble-down cooper shop on the bank to wait for everybody to go away. Well, I was the all night. They was somebody round all the time. Long 'bout 6 in the morning, skiffs began to go by, and 'bout 8 or 9 every skiff that went long was talking about how your pop come over to the town and say you's killed. These last skiffs was full of old ladies and men a-going over for to see the place. Sometimes they pull up in the shore and take a rest before they start across. So by the talk I got to know all about the killing. I is powerful sorry you's killed, Huck, but I ain't no more now. I laid under the shavings all day. I is hungry, but I wasn't afraid, because I know old Mrs. and the widow was going to start the camp meeting right after breakfast and be gone all day and day. Knows I go off with the cattle about daylight, so they wouldn't expect to see me round the place, and so they wouldn't miss me till arter dark in the evening. The other servants wouldn't miss me, 'cause they didn't shin out to take holidays soon as the old folks is out in the way. Well, when it came dark, I tuck under the river road and went about 2 mile or more, where they weren't no houses. I made up my mind 'bout what I was going to do. You see, if I kept on trying to get away afoot, these dogs would track me. If I stole a skiff to cross over, they missed the skiff, you see, and they'd know about what I'd laid on the other side and where you pick up my tracks. So I says a waff is what I oughter do and make no track. I see a light a-comin' round the pimp by me by, so I wade in and shove along ahead. Me was swum more'n halfway across the river and got in amongst the driftwood and kept my head down low and kenned to swim again the current till the raft come along. Then I swum to the stern if it took a holt. It clouded up in the pooty dock for a little while, so I climbed up and laid down on the planks. These men was all ye yonder in the middle was the lanterns was. The river was a wisin', and des was a good current, so I reckoned that by and fo and mudder I'd swim 5 mile down the river, and den I'd slip in just before daylight and swim ashore and take the woods on the Illinois side. But I didn't have no luck. When we mosed down to the head of the island, a man began to come after with the lantern. I see it weren't no use for to wait, so I slid overboard and struck out for the island. Well, I had a notion I could lay a mose anywhere, but I couldn't bank to buff. I mosed the foot of the island before I found a good place. I went into woods and judging I wouldn't fool with no waff no more, long as they moving the lantern round. So I had my pipe and her plug dog-legging, some matches in my cap, and they weren't wet, so I was all right. And so you ain't had no meat to eat nor bread to eat all this time? Why didn't you get mud turkles? How you going to get 'em? You can't slip up on 'em to grab 'em. How's a body going to hit 'em with a walk? How could a body do it in the night? and I wa'n't gwine to show myself on the bank in the daylight." "Well, that's so. You've had to keep in the woods all the time, of course. Did you hear 'em shooting the cannon?" "Oh, yes. I know dey was arter you. I see 'em go by, hey, watchin' 'em through bushes." Some young birds came along, flying a yard or two at a time, and lightning. Jim said it was a sign it was going to rain. He said it was a sign when the young chickens flew that way, and so we reckoned it was the same way when the young birds done it. I was going to catch some of them, but Jim wouldn't let me. He said it was death. He said his father laid mighty sick once, and some of them catch a bird, and his old granny said to his father would die, and he did. And Jim said you mustn't count the things you are going to cook for dinner, because that would bring bad luck. The same if you shook the tablecloth after sundown. And he said if a man owned a beehive and that man died, the bees must be told about it before the sun up next morning, or else the bees would all weaken down and quit work and die. Jim had said bees wouldn't sting idiots, but I didn't believe that, because I had tried them lots of times myself, and they wouldn't sting me. I had heard about some of these things before, but not all of them. Jim knowed all kinds of signs. He said he knowed most everything. I said it looked to me like all the signs was about bad luck, so I asked him if there weren't any good luck signs. He says, "Mighty few, and it ain't no use to a body. What you want to know when you get good luck's a-comin' for, want to keep it off." And he says, "If you got hairy arms and a hairy briz, it's a sign that you are going to be rich. And well, dey's some use in sign like that, case it's so fur ahead. You see, maybe you's got to be posed a long time fustin' so you might get discouraged and kill yourself. You didn't know by the sign that you're going to be rich by me by. Have you got hairy arms and a hairy breast, Jim?" "What's the use axin' that question? Don't you see I has?" "Well, are you rich?" "No, but I been rich once and gwine to be rich again. Onct I had $14, but I tuck to speculating and got busted out." "What did you speculate in, Jim?" "Well, first I tackled stock." "What kind of stock?" "Why, livestock, cattle, you know. I put $10 in a cow, but I ain't gwine to rest no more money in stock. The cow up and died on my hands." "So you lost the $10? "No, I didn't lose it at all. I only lost about 9 of it. I sold the hide or taller for a 10 and 10 cents. "You had $5.10 left? Did you speculate any more?" "Yes. You know that one-legged nigger dis belonged to old Mr. Bradish? Well, he sot up a bank and said anybody that put in $1 would give for dollars more at end the year. Well, all the niggers went in, but they didn't have much. I was the only one that had much, so I stuck out for more than $4, and then if I said I didn't get it, I'd start a bank myself. Well, of course that nigger want to keep me out of the business, because he said he dain't want business enough for 2 banks. So he said I could put in $5 and he pays me $35 atter den under the year. So I done it. Then I reckon I'd invest the $35 right off and keep things moving. There was a nigger named Bob that had catched a wood flat and his marsters didn't know it, and I bought it off of him and took him to take the $35, which dinner do you come? But somebody stole the wood flat that night, and the next day the one-legged nigger said the bank's busted, so they didn't none of us get no money." "What did you do with the 10 cents, Jim?" "Well, I was gwine to spend it, but I had a dream, and the dream told me to give it to a nigger named Balaam. Balaam's ass, they called him for short. He's one of dem chuckleheads, you know. But he's lucky. Dey sayin' I see I wa'n't lucky. De dream said let Balaam invest dis 10 cent and de make a raise for me. Well, Balaam, he tuck de money in where it was in church. He hear de preacher say dat whoever give it to Poland to do Lord and bounce to get it, his money back 100 times. So Balaam, he tuck it to give it to 10 cents to de po and laid low to see what was gwine to come of it. Well, what to come of it, Jim? Nuffin never came of it. I couldn't manage to click de money, no way. And Balaam, he couldn't. I ain't gwine to lend no money mo' about it. I see de security bound to get yo' money back 100 times, de preacher says. If I could get de 10 cent back, I'd call it squaw and be glad de chance. Well, it's all right anyway, Jim, long as you're going to be rich again sometime or another. Yes, and I'd rich now. Come to look at it, I owes myself and I was $800. I wish I had the money. I wouldn't want no more. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Chapter 9. I wanted to go and look at a place right about in the middle of the island that I found when I was exploring, so we started and soon got to it, because the island was only 3 miles long and 1/4 of a mile wide. This place was a tolerable long, steep hill or ridge about 40 foot high. We had a rough time getting to the top. The sides was so steep and the bushes so thick. We trampled and clumbed around all over it, and by found a good big cavern in the rock, most up to the top on the side towards Illinois. The cavern was as big as 2 or 3 rooms bunched together, and Jim could stand up straight in it. It was cool in there. Jim was for putting out our traps there right away, but I said we didn't want to be climbing up and down there all the time. Jim said if we hid the canoe in a good place and had all the traps in the cavern, we could rush there if anybody was to come to the island, and if they would never find us without the dogs. And besides, he said them little birds had said it was going to rain, and did I want the things to get wet? So we went back and got to the canoe and paddled up abreast the cavern and lugged all the traps up there. Then we hunted up a place close to hid the canoe in, amongst the thick willows. We took some fish over to the lines and set them again and begun to get ready for dinner. The door of the cavern was big enough to roll a hogshead in, and on one side of the door the floor stuck out a little bit and was flat and a good place to build a fire on. So we built it there and cooked dinner. We spread the blankets inside for a carpet and eat our dinner in there. We put all the other things handy at the back of the cavern. Pretty soon it darkened up and began to thunder and lightning. So the birds were right about it. Directly it began to rain, and it rained like all fury too, and I never seen the wind blow so. It was one of those regular summer storms. It would get so dark that it looked all blue and black outside, and lovely, and the rain would thrash along by so thick that the trees off a little ways looked dim and spiderwebby, and here would come a blast of wind that would bend the trees down and turn up the pale underside of the leaves, and then a perfect ripper of gust would follow along and set the branches to tossing their arms as if they were just wild. And next, when it was just about the bluest and blackest, it was as bright as glory, and you'd have a little glimpse of treetops of plunging about away off yonder in the storm, hundreds of yards further than you could see before dark as sin again in a second. And now you'd hear the thunder let go with an awful crash, and then go rumbling, grumbling, tumbling down the sky towards the utter side of the world, like rolling empty barrels downstairs, where it's long stairs and they'd bounce a good deal, you know. Jim, this is nice, I says. I wouldn't want to be nowhere else but here. Pass me along another hunk of fish and some hot cornbread. Well, you wouldn't been here if there hadn't been it for Jim. You'd a been down in the woods without any dinner and getting moss drowned too. Dat you would. Honey, chickens know when it's gwine to wane, and so den the birds, Chilly. The river went on racing and racing for 10 or 12 days, till at last it was over the banks. The water was 3 or 4 foot deep on the island in the low places and on the Illinois bottom, or on that side it was good many miles wide, but on the Missouri side it was the same old distance across, a half a mile, because the Missouri shore was just a wall of high bluffs. Daytimes we paddled all over the island in the canoe. It was mighty cool and shady in the deep woods, even if the sun was blazing outside. We went winding in and out amongst the trees, and sometimes the vines hung so thick that we had to back away and go the other way. Well, on every old broken down tree you could see rabbits and snakes and such things, and when the island had been overflowed a day or two, they got so tame on account of being hungry that you could paddle right up and put your hand on them if you wanted to. But not the snakes and turtles. They would slide off in the water. The ridge our cavern was in was full of them. We could have had pets enough if we wanted 'em. One night we catched a little section of a lumber raft, nice pine planks. It was 12 foot wide and about 15 or 16 foot long at the top, stood above the water 6 or 7 inches, a solid level floor. We could see how saw logs go by in the daylight, sometimes, but we would let them go. We didn't show ourselves in daylight. Another night when we was up at the head of the island, just before daylight, here comes a frame house down on the west side. She was a 2-story and tilted over considerably. We paddled out and got aboard, clumbed in at an upstairs window, but it was so dark yet to see, we made the canoe fast and set her way for daylight. The light begun to come before we got to the foot of the island. Then we looked in at the window. We could make out a bed and a table and 2 old chairs and lots of things around about on the floor, and there were clothes hanging against the wall. There was something laying on the floor in the far corner that looked like a man, so Jim says, "Hello, you!" But it didn't budge, so I hollered again, and then Jim says, "De man ain't asleep, he dead. You hold still, I'll go get and see." He went and bent down and looked and says, "It's a dead man, yes indeedy, naked too. He been shot in de back. I reckon he been dead 2 or 3 days. Come in, Huck. Do and look at his face. It's too ghastly." I didn't look at him at all. Jim thrown some old rags over him, but he needn't done it. I didn't want to see him. There was heaps of old greasy cards scattered around over the floor, and an old whiskey bottles and a couple of masks made out of black cloth, and all over the walls were the ignorance kind of words and pictures made with charcoal. There was old, dirty calico dresses and a sunbonnet and some women's underclothes hanging against the wall, and some man's clothings too. We put the lot in the canoe. It might come good. There was a boy's old speckled straw hat on the floor. I took that too. And there was a bottle that had milk in it and had a rag stopper for a baby to suck. We would took the bottle, but it was broke. There was a seedy old chest and an old hair trunk with the hinges broke. They stood open, but weren't nothing left in them to any account. The way things was scattered about, we reckoned the people left in a hurry and weren't fixin' to so carry off much of their stuff. We got an old tin lantern and a butcher knife without any handle, and a brand new Barlow knife worth 2 bits in any store, and a lot of tallow candles and a tin candlestick and a gourd and a tin cup and a ratty old bed quilt off the bed, and a reticule with needles and pins and beeswax and buttons and threads and all such trunk in it, and a hatchet and some nails, and a fish line as thick as my little finger with some monstrous hooks on it, and a roll of buckskin and a leather dog collar and a horseshoe and some vials of medicine that didn't have no label on 'em. And just as we was leaving, I found an old tolerable good curry comb, and Jim, he found a ratty old fiddle bow and a wooden leg. The straps was broke off of it, but barrin' that, it wasn't good enough leg, though it was too long for me and not long enough for Jim, and we couldn't find the other one, though we hunted all around. And so, take it all around, we made a good haul. When we was ready to shove off, we was a quarter of a mile below the island, and it was a pretty broad day. So I made Jim lay down in the canoe and cover up with the quilt, because if he had set up, people could tell he was a nigger a good ways off. I paddled over to the Illinois shore and drifted down to most a half a mile doing it. I crept up the dead water under the bank and had no accidents and didn't see nobody. We got home all safe.